The wind had a cruel voice that winter, dry, bitter, and filled with dust from the dying plains. It whistled through the crooked boardwalks of Red Hollow, a forgotten frontier town that seemed to sag under the weight of its own silence on one such morning, beneath a sky the color of old tin. A woman trudged through the street clutching the small hand of a little girl. Her name was Clara Mayfield, and every step she took echoed hunger. Once she'd been a rancher's wife, proud, laughing, her hair shining gold in the summer sun, but now her boots were torn, her coat threadbare, and her eyes hollow from too many nights without sleep. Her daughter, Emma, no older than 6, walked beside her in a faded shawl, her cheeks pale from the cold. They had come into town seeking one thing, bread. The townsfolk had seen them before. Some offered a nod. Others turned away. Pity had run dry here long ago. Just like the rivers, the grocer had already refused her twice that week, saying there was no more charity left in Red Hollow. Still, Clara went to him again. Desperation, she'd learned, had no pride inside the trading post. The air smelled of coffee grounds and tobacco smoke. Shelves lined with tins and flour sacks seemed to mock her with their abundance. The storekeeper, Mr. Grady, looked up from his ledger with a scowl. Not again. Mrs. Mayfield, he said, shaking his head before she could speak, can't keep giving credit to ghosts. Her voice trembled. Please. Mr. Grady, just one loaf. My girl hasn't eaten since yesterday. He sighed, glancing toward the shelves. Times are hard all over. You've got nothing left to trade. Clara hesitated. Then, with shaking fingers, she reached up and pulled the ribbon from her hair. Golden locks tumbled down her shoulders, glinting faintly in the lamplight. I'll trade this, she whispered. Cut it off. You can sell it to the wig maker in Dodge. Just, please, give me bread. For a moment, even Grady faltered. The room had gone still behind her. A few men at the counter turned to look, faces etched with the same weary shame that lived in every broken town along the frontier. Then a quiet voice broke the silence. Don't. At the far end of the room stood a cowboy, tall and dust-covered from the trail. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his tone carried something steady, like the earth after rain. He stepped forward, pulled a silver dollar from his pocket, and placed it on the counter. Keep your hair. Ma'am, he said softly, I'll feed you both. Clara froze. The words seemed unreal. Her hand still clutched the ribbon. Trembling, she wanted to speak, to refuse, to thank him, to cry, but nothing came. The storekeeper shrugged, taking the coin and handing her a loaf of bread and a small sack of flour. Clara's hands closed around them as if afraid they might vanish. The cowboy tipped his hat slightly. Meeting her eyes, there was no pity in his gaze, only quiet understanding. Ma'am, he said, ain't no shame in needing help. We all been there once. Clara swallowed hard, a single tear tracing down her cheek. Emma tugged her sleeve, whispering, Mama, can we eat now? The cowboy gave a faint smile. Go on. The wind's turning cold. As they stepped outside, the snow began to fall, soft and slow. Like a prayer, Clara looked down at her daughter clutching the bread and then back toward the stranger, disappearing down the street for the first time in months. Her heart stirred with something she'd thought long dead, hope, and though she didn't yet know it, that one act of mercy, a single silver dollar in a forgotten town, would change all 3 of their lives forever. The man's name was Jacob Holt, a trail-worn cowboy who had spent the better part of his life chasing horizons that never stayed still. He'd come to Red Hollow that morning for supplies, coffee, ammunition, horse feed, simple things that kept a man alive on the range. But as he stood at the back of the trading post, watching that widow offer her hair for bread, something deep inside him cracked open like dry earth meeting rain. Jacob had seen hardship before. He'd seen mothers bury their children after droughts, men sell their saddles for whiskey, and boys grow old before their time. The frontier didn't spare anyone. Yet there was something about this woman, the way she stood proud even in her desperation, her trembling hands holding on to dignity when she had nothing else. That struck him harder than he cared to admit. He lingered by the shelves, pretending to inspect a bag of oats while his mind drifted to another time. His own mother, her hands raw from scrubbing, her eyes hollow from loss. She'd been left widowed after his father fell to fever, and Jacob, then only 10, had watched her trade her wedding ring for a bag of grain. That memory never left him. So when Clara Mayfield's voice cracked as she said, "Cut it off. Just give me enough to feed my girl," it wasn't a stranger's cry he heard. It was an echo of his own past. Without thinking, he'd stepped forward and placed that silver dollar on the counter. A simple act, nothing heroic. Yet the weight of it lingered in the air like the aftershock of a gunshot outside. The wind picked up. Jacob followed at a distance as Clara and her daughter stepped into the cold. He saw the little girl clutching the bread to her chest, smiling faintly up at her mother, a smile that was small but stubborn, the kind that refused to die even in the hardest winters. Jacob leaned against a hitching post, chewing on a piece of straw, and watched them head down the street toward the edge of town where the land turned to open prairie. A tattered tent peeked from behind an old livery barn, their shelter. If you could call it that. He could have left then. He'd done his part. But something about their silhouettes in the fading light held him there. He remembered long nights on the trail, the ache of loneliness that crept in when the campfire burned. Lo, the way a man's soul could start to hollow out without warmth or company. He wondered how many nights that woman had faced that same silence with a child to protect and no one to lean on as dusk settled. Jacob found himself walking toward the saloon. Though the whiskey in his glass tasted like guilt more than comfort, he overheard the townsmen whispering about the widow, how her husband died defending his ranch, how the bank took everything, how she stayed behind instead of leaving for the east. Fool woman, one man muttered, should have gone when she had the chance. Jacob set his glass down hard enough to make the room fall quiet. Ain't foolish to fight for what's yours, he said flatly, eyes cold as flint. Foolish is standing by while a woman starves in your own town. No one replied. They didn't have to when Jacob stepped out again. The moon hung low and silver over Red Hollow. The wind had softened, but the air carried a chill that whispered of the storm coming. He looked toward the prairie where that flickering tent light glowed faintly in the dark. A man like him didn't have much, a horse, a gun, and a heart he'd long stopped trusting. But that night, as he mounted his horse and gazed toward the widow's tent, Jacob realized something he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't just ride away, not from her, not from that little girl, not from the chance, however small, to set something right in a world that had gone so wrong. So, instead of heading west as he'd planned, Jacob Holt rode out toward the prairie, toward the faint glimmer of firelight, and the two souls who didn't yet know that mercy had already found them. The wind had settled into a weary hush by the time Jacob Holt reached the edge of town. The prairie stretched before him, endless, lonely and cold as an empty heart in the distance. A faint orange flicker pulsed against the darkness. A campfire. Her campfire. He hesitated for a moment, the reins tight in his hands. He wasn't a man used to meddling in other folks' troubles. Life on the trail had taught him to keep moving, to let the world's pain drift past like dust. But that night, something refused to let him ride on. When he approached the small camp, he found Clara Mayfield kneeling beside the fire, coaxing a weak flame to life. Her little girl, Emma, lay wrapped in a threadbare blanket, her small body curled close to the warmth. The bread Jacob had bought sat on a rock nearby, half eaten, the other half saved for tomorrow. Clara looked up, startled when she saw the cowboy dismount. "You followed us," she said, her voice wary. Jacob took off his hat. "Didn't mean to startle you, ma'am. Just thought you might need a bit more than bread to get through the night." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle of dried meat, beans, and coffee. Setting it down near the fire, the gesture was simple, But the silence that followed carried the weight of a lifetime. Clara's lips parted. She wanted to protest, to keep her pride intact, but Emma's sleepy voice broke the tension. "Mama, is he an angel?" The question made Jacob chuckle softly. "Afraid not. Little one, just a cowboy who don't like seeing folks go hungry." Clara's eyes softened, though her shoulders stayed tense. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. People talk a woman alone." Jacob nodded. "They'll talk no matter what. Let Something in his calmness disarmed her. She gestured for him to sit. "Well, if you're staying, you can have some coffee. Weak as it is?" He settled beside the fire, his hat in his lap. They sat in quiet for a long while, the flames crackling between them like a fragile bridge. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "My husband was killed last spring," she said. "Cattle thieves. He tried to fight them off. I buried him with my own hands." Jacob's jaw tightened. He didn't look at her right away. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and meant it. She nodded, staring into the fire. "The bank took our land, said a woman couldn't keep a ranch alone. I tried to find work, but no one hires widows with a child, so here we are." Jacob poked at the fire with a stick, the light flickering across his weathered face. "The world's got a way of tacking from good folks," he murmured. "I reckon that's why we're put here, to give a little back when we can." Clara glanced at him, searching his face for deceit, and found none. For the first time in months, she felt something stir inside her, a faint warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They ate in silence, the simple meal filling the air with the scent of beans and smoke. Emma giggled softly at one of Jacob's trail stories, her laughter fragile but real. The sound seemed to thaw something frozen inside all three of them. When the child finally drifted to sleep, Jacob stood. "I'll head out now," he said. "Didn't mean to intrude." Clara looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't." He nodded once and turned toward his horse. The firelight painted him in gold and shadow, but as he rode away into the night, Clara watched the fading shape of him and realized, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely alone. And though Jacob Holt didn't know it yet, the image of that widow and her sleeping child by the fire would follow him long after dawn, a memory that refused to fade. A call his heart could no longer ignore. The sun rose pale and cold the next morning, its light struggling through a sky bruised with winter clouds. Clara Mayfield woke to the soft crackle of dying embers and the slow, steady rhythm of her daughter's breathing. Emma slept peacefully for the first time in days, her small face relaxed, a crust of bread still clutched in her hand. Clara brushed the girl's hair from her forehead and looked out at the wide plains beyond. Their tent, the world stretched endlessly, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. She wondered how much longer she could keep Emma safe, how much more she could endure before the prairie claimed them too. Then she saw movement in the distance, a lone rider approaching through the dawn mist. Her heart leapt, fear prickling along her skin, but as the figure came closer, she recognized the familiar stance, the easy way he sat in the saddle. It was Jacob Holt. He reined in his horse a few yards from the camp and tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am," he called gently. "Didn't mean to intrude again." Clara rose slowly, pulling her shawl tighter around her. "You didn't, but I reckon most men would have kept riding." Jacob smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I've seen what happens when folks look away. Don't sit right with me." He dismounted and unstrapped a bundle from his horse, a small sack of flour, a bit of salt pork, and an extra blanket. "Couldn't sleep much," he said. "Figured you and the little one might need this more than I do." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but a sudden cough from Emma cut her off, dry, hollow, and sharp. Jacob's expression changed instantly. "She sick?" "Just the cold," Clara said quickly. Though her eyes betrayed her worry, Jacob nodded toward his horse. "My place ain't far. A half-day's ride north. Got a roof, a stove, And medicine, you're welcome to come till she's better. Clara stiffened. I don't take charity. He met her gaze steadily. Ain't charity if it saves a life. For a long moment. Neither spoke. The wind whistled through the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of snow. Clara looked down at Emma, pale and fragile beneath her blanket, and her resolve cracked. All right, she whispered, just till she's well. Jacob's nod was simple, without triumph. That's all I ask. The ride to his homestead was long and silent. The land opened wide, rolling plains dotted with sagebrush and the occasional cottonwood tree. Jacob's ranch sat in a shallow valley, modest but solid, a single log cabin, a small corral, a barn weathered by wind and time. He helped Clara down from the horse, his touch careful, respectful. Emma stirred weakly in her arms, eyes blinking open at the sight of the cabin inside. The warmth of the wood stove wrapped around them like a long-lost embrace. Jacob poured water from a kettle and handed Clara a tin cup. You can rest here as long as you need, he said. Clara looked around. The simple furnishings, the scent of pine smoke, the soft creak of the floorboards. It wasn't much, but it felt safe. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the walls of a home around her. Days passed slowly but kindly. Emma's cough eased. Clara cooked small meals, mended torn clothes, and swept the floor with quiet gratitude. Jacob worked outside, tending the horses, mending fences, chopping wood. Yet each evening, when the chores were done, he'd sit with them by the fire, sharing stories of the trail, tales that made Emma giggle and coaxed faint smiles from Clara's tired face. The distance between them began to shrink, not with words but with acts of quiet mercy. And one night, as snow fell softly against the window, Clara looked at Jacob across the firelight, the man who'd turned strangers into family, and realized something she never thought she would again. She wasn't afraid anymore. Winter had settled heavy across the plains. The sky was a sheet of iron, the wind sharp enough to cut through bone, and every sound, from the creak of the barn door to the rustle of the dry grass, felt like a warning inside the small log cabin. The fire burned bright, but Clara Mayfield could feel the cold pressing against the walls like a living thing. She stood by the window, watching Jacob Holt saddle his horse. Snow drifted through the gray morning, soft at first, but thickening fast. He was heading out to check the cattle, a stubborn herd grazing near the creek that hadn't yet returned to the corral. Jacob, she said, stepping onto the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The storm's turning bad. Those cattle can wait. He gave her that quiet, steady look she'd come to know, the kind that said his mind was made up. If I don't go, we'll lose half the herd. I'll be back before dark. She frowned. You always say that. Jacob smiled faintly, his breath misting in the cold. And I always keep my word. Clara wanted to argue, but the wind howled louder, snatching the words from her lips. Instead, she simply said, Be careful. He touched the brim of his hat. Always am. Then he rode off into the white distance, the snow swallowing his figure until all that remained was the echo of hoofbeats fading into the storm hours. Past the day dim too soon? The light draining from the world until the prairie was nothing but swirling white. Emma played quietly near the fire, humming to her doll while Clara paced the cabin, her stomach twisting tighter with every gust of wind that rattled the windows. By nightfall, the storm had turned violent. Snow slammed against the roof, wind shrieked through the cracks, and the door shuddered on its hinges. Jacob was still not back. Clara's heart pounded. She went to the door again and again, peering into the storm, praying for movement, for the shadow of a horse, the sound of a voice, but there was nothing. Only the endless, merciless white. When Emma asked softly, Mama, is he coming home? Clara couldn't answer. The thought of losing someone again, after she'd only just begun to believe in life again, was unbearable. Finally, she made her choice. Clara pulled on Jacob's spare coat, boots too big for her feet, and wrapped Emma in every blanket she could find. "Stay by the fire, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Mama's going to bring him home." She stepped into the storm, the wind nearly knocking her to her knees. The cold burned her lungs, but she pushed forward. Following the faint tracks in the snow, the night swallowed her whole. A blur of white and wind and prayer time lost meaning. She stumbled, fell, rose again, then, through the howling dark, she saw it, a shape half buried in snow near a broken fence post. Jacob's horse lay nearby, still breathing, and Jacob, pale, unmoving, was sprawled beside it, his coat crusted with frost. "Jacob!" she cried. Dropping to her knees, she pressed her hands to his chest, still warm. "Thank God." She dragged him onto the horse's saddle, straining against the cold, and led the animal back through the storm. When they reached the cabin, Clara collapsed beside him by the fire, rubbing his hands. Wrapping him in every blanket, hours passed before he stirred, his eyes opening weakly to her tear-streaked face. "You came for me," he rasped. Clara smiled through her tears. "Of course I did. You once saved us. It was my turn." He tried to speak, but she silenced him with a whisper. "Don't talk. You're home." Outside, the storm howled on, wild and unforgiving, but inside that cabin, warmth bloomed again. Two souls, once lost to grief and loneliness, had found each other in the fiercest of nights, and when the wind finally quieted, it carried not despair, but something new, the sound of hearts still beating, bound by mercy and love stronger than any storm. When the long winter finally broke, it did so gently, as if the land itself was tired of sorrow and struggle. Snow melted into silver streams that trickled down the hills, and the prairie bloomed with new life. Wildflowers painted the meadows, and the air was sweet with the promise of beginnings. For Clara Mayfield, spring wasn't just a change of season, it was a quiet rebirth. The memory of the storm still haunted her dreams, but it also reminded her of what she and Jacob Holt had become to each other. No longer two lost souls crossing paths out of pity. They were something deeper, partners in survival, tethered by compassion and courage. Jacob had taken weeks to heal from the frostbite and exhaustion, but his spirit remained strong. He often sat on the porch, a blanket draped over his legs, watching Clara and Emma hang laundry in the warm breeze. The sight stirred something in him that no ranch, no gold, no victory ever had. Peace. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the prairie, Jacob turned to Clara, who was mending a quilt beside him. "You know," he said softly, "when I first saw you in that bakery, trying to trade your hair for bread, I thought the world had broken something in you." Clara looked up, her hands stilling. "Maybe it had," he nodded slowly, "but I see now, it didn't break you. It just stripped away everything that wasn't real. So what was left could grow stronger." Her eyes softened. "You gave me a chance to grow again," Jacob chuckled quietly. "You gave me a reason to stay alive." There was no grand confession, no kiss under the wide western sky, only a silence full of meaning. Two hearts speaking in the language of survival and gratitude, but in that silence, something sacred bloomed, the beginning of love, unspoken yet undeniable. Weeks passed, and the ranch began to change with the season. Jacob expanded the corral, repaired fences, and built a small garden beside the cabin. Clara planted seeds, beans, carrots, corn, while Emma chased butterflies between the rows. Laughter began to echo across the prairie again, and every sound felt like a prayer answered. Yet, beneath the peace, Clara carried a quiet fear that this mercy she'd found might somehow slip away. Life had never been kind to her for long. One evening, as thunder rolled faintly on the horizon, she found Jacob in the barn, polishing his saddle. "You're leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked up, startled. "No, not leaving." "Preparing for what?" Jacob smiled gently. For a new life, Clara, for a future I was thinking. We could ride into town together next week, register the land, get supplies, maybe even." He paused, almost shy. "Make things official?" She blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "Official?" He stood, brushing dust from his coat. "You, me. Emma, this family we've built. It's time the world knew it wasn't just chance that brought us together." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. But this time they were not from pain. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as it brushed his Jacob. "You don't owe us anything." He shook his head. "No. Clara, I don't, but I choose you. That's what makes it real." Outside, the first drops of spring rain began to fall, gentle, cleansing. Full of life, the storm that had once nearly taken everything from them now seemed like a distant memory. Clara leaned into his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath her palm for the first time in years. She felt safe, truly safe, when dawn rose the next morning. The prairie glistened with dew. A new chapter had begun, not just for Clara and Jacob, but for the little family they'd built out of mercy and love. Emma ran barefoot through the grass, laughter echoing in the sunlight, while Jacob hitched the wagon for their trip into town. Clara stood at the doorway, watching them, her heart full. Once she had been a widow begging for bread. Now she was a woman reborn, loved, secure, and strong, and as the wind whispered through the wildflowers, it carried the quiet truth of their story. Sometimes mercy isn't a single act, it's the beginning of forever.